My expertise, as you've heard, is in Australian history. Australian history was first studied by scholars who knew their British and European history very well. But at the time when I was learning Australian history at university, there was a reaction against too much attention being given to Britain. This was the 1960s, the time of national self-assertion. Australian history became a worthy subject of study in itself and was not to be seen as an adjunct to British history. So Australian historians claimed a higher status for themselves at the cost of giving an intelligible account of their subject. When I began to research Australian history, I was regularly scanning the pages of the early 19th century newspapers. On the day after the mail ships arrived from Britain, the whole paper would be given over to British news and opinion. Not summaries, but articles themselves. "Great," I said, turning over these pages. "Nothing for me to look at here. I am making excellent progress." As I later realised, this was in fact highly significant news, significant local news. For who's in and who's out at Westminster, what causes were flourishing and what languishing, what Britain was and what it was becoming, these were important matters in colonial politics. Australia took its shape within the British world, not simply the world when the pioneer colonists departed, but the British world as it continued to be. My own writing came to reflect this notion of how to understand Australian history, but my teaching followed the pattern of my own student days. One day in a tutorial, a student referred to someone called Gladstone. "This is no good," I said to myself. "Students of Australian history must really know British history." So I created a subject called Britain and Australia, in which Britain was a continuing presence. 18th century Britain, before we looked at convict Sydney. Liberal reform and Chartism in Britain, before liberalism and democracy in mid-19th century Australia. Radicalism and republicanism in late 19th century Britain, before the trade unions and Labour parties in Australia. One day in a tutorial devoted to movements for self-improvement in early 19th century Britain, a student asked me what was the Enlightenment, which had been referred to in the material he'd been reading. This was pre-Google and pre-Wikipedia, though not before encyclopedias. The student could have found an answer to his question, but he was the prompt for my next departure in teaching. I would offer a course called Introduction to European Civilization. My colleagues allowed me to use the term civilization, which is suspect in the academy, though I noticed that the term Islamic civilization arouses less hostility. My colleagues were worried more that my offering would be superficial. They offered more specialised and limited subjects in which students could work closely on historical materials and problems. Undoubtedly, these do engage students. But the student who takes only subjects of this sort may learn how to be an historian, but ends up knowing not much history. I wanted my subject to expand the student's knowledge base, which is an uncommon aim in faculties of humanities. But I did not want to be superficial. My plan was to offer students in the first week an overview of European history, given in 2 lectures. At the end of that, I would say to them, you now know more about European history than people who study here for 3 years. This, by the way, was a first-year course. Then in 6 weeks, to offer themes that carried right through the history, on government, languages, the common people, and so on. Then 16 weeks, more traditionally, moving chronologically through history and dealing with standard topics, the fall of Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance and Reformation, scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment. So the students made 3 passes through the history, meeting names and dates, events and movements in different contexts, so their knowledge grew by familiarity rather than by rote learning. I ran tests, mini exams, on the knowledge base. This approach also pushed me to get to the essence of European civilization. What makes it distinctive? Those few teachers who do offer broad-ranging histories of Europe usually avoid this question. The students study causation of major events, or more commonly nowadays, they follow the oppressions and exclusions of European societies, constantly amazed that equal opportunity commissions have not operated through all time, and never pondering why they now operate in Canberra and Melbourne and not in Beijing or Riyadh. It is the economic historians, as you've just heard, who take more interest in Europe's distinctive qualities, as they try to explain why rapid economic growth and industrialisation first occurred in Europe rather than, say, in China, which was, for centuries, was the more advanced civilization. The essence of Europe, as I presented it to my students, was that it is a mixture. The classical world of Greece and Rome, Christianity, and the culture of the German warriors who took over the Roman Empire in the West. How these elements came together and how they interacted through time, this provides the dynamic of European civilization. So German warriors became Christian knights. The Christian church, growing up in the Roman Empire, imitated its hierarchical governing structure, with the Pope replacing the Emperor. But since its holy book made little mention of this structure, it was open to Luther to say that when the church became Roman, it lost its way. Amazingly, the church had preserved much of the pagan learning of Greece and Rome, which the scholars of the Renaissance used to imagine Greece and Rome before they were Christian, and so tipped Europe into its secular path. The scientific revolution overthrew Greek teaching about the planets and the sun, but it did so by following the Greek hunch that the answers to the deeper mysteries would be simple and mathematical. The other dynamic, connected to the first, was that Europe was not a single state, but a network of states in competition with each other, and in which state and religious power were in different hands. These are large themes. How did students with so few points of reference make sense of them? It was my job to particularise and make them concrete. One tactic for this was the use of the Bible. Students were asked to bring a Bible, and I supplied copies to students who couldn't lay their hands on one. I got my copies free from the Gideons, who were delighted to learn that a religious revival had broken out at La Trobe University. The Bible was used to make a passage through the whole history, the Roman authorities dealing with Paul, the advocate of a crazy new religion. The biblical texts a medieval pope used to claim supremacy over kings. The text which persuaded Luther that faith alone would save him. What the scientific revolution did to the account of the position of the earth in Genesis. What a scholar of the Enlightenment would think of a Jewish warrior bidding the sun stand still and succeeding. You see, I was starting from the ground up to acculturate the students who mostly had been brought up impoverished. My subject was a success. Students enrolled in large numbers and accepted the discipline it entailed. They quite liked being told they had to learn things. While I continued to teach this subject, I joined with John Carroll in sociology and Robert Mann in politics in designing a new degree in Western culture. We stipulated closely what subjects students could take from those already offered in history, politics, art history, sociology, English, and philosophy. Taken together, these provided a good understanding of the Western tradition. Some of these we taught ourselves. From those offered by our colleagues, we chose those that were comprehensive and profound, rather than scrappy and modish. So the history of modern political thought, rather than Australian politics in the 20th century. Plato and Aristotle, rather than environmental philosophy. European history in the 19th century, in the 19th and 20th centuries, rather than the history of food and drink. You will be pleased to know that while there is much to regret in the modern university, we could assemble a degree of this sort. The bad news is that though we attracted some very good students to this degree, who became enthusiasts for it, not enough students wanted to take it for it to survive. I foolishly thought that since we three founders had a profile in the wider community, students might be attracted to our degree. But appearance in the quality press is not going to be noticed by students who don't read the quality press or any other. I think the chief reason for the disappointing result is that students relish the freedom of choosing from a smorgasbord of subjects according to interest or when the subject is offered or the ease with which its demands can be met. Here, the inclination of students marries with the academic's desire not to define a course of study, but to teach their specialty. If you want a degree in medicine or law, your course is closely defined. If anyone were to propose that students wanting a BA should, whatever else they study, acquire some understanding of the riches of the Western tradition, I can predict the result. The proposal would be denounced in one word, and you've already heard it: Eurocentric. And this, despite the multicultural insistence that everyone should be connected to their culture. There are two grounds for inducting students into European civilization. It is their own, and it happens that European civilization in the last 500 years has had a profound influence on every quarter of the globe. For the moment, these are unpersuasive arguments. I am not too disheartened by this. Among general readers, perhaps even our BAs after they have grown up, there is a great appetite for books of wide sweep and significance. I am thinking of The Passion of the Western Mind in philosophy, Harold Bloom's The Western Canon in literature, the history books and TV shows by Simon Sharma. In academic journals, the tone is mean and rancorous, but in the contributions to our press by Peter Craven in literature and Christopher Allen in art, there is delight and wonder and a proper sense of enduring value. Neither holds a university position, and indeed they would be out of place there. For the moment, the universities, or at least the faculties of arts and humanities, are not the chief transmitters of the culture. Thank you.